Once again, thank you for joining us here today. This is the IEU Webinar on the Evaluability Study of the GCF funding proposal. This webinar is meant to introduce the findings of the IEU learning paper, Evaluability Assessment of the GCF funding proposals. My name is Andreas Reumann. I'm the acting head of the Independent Evaluation Unit of the Green Climate Fund. And for our webinar today, I'm also joined by my colleague, Galina Uvarova, Data and GIS Officer here at the Independent Evaluation Unit. So colleagues, for today, both of us will introduce the study, starting with the background, followed by some of the key findings with regards to the quality at entry of funding proposals, and then turning into a comparison between the initial resource mobilization period versus the GCF1 period, and finally some reflection on the different themes as well as the differences across groups of countries with regard to the evaluability of funding proposals. So next slide, please. Yes, so as we turn to the background of the study, the initial study was undertaken in 2018 to inform the first performance review and the first and forward-looking performance review of the GCF, the FPR. The IEU has updated the study to inform, among other things, also the second performance review of the GCF in 2022. The study basically assesses the quality of entry of 143 funded projects based on their submitted funding proposals and considering 4 main categories, which I will highlight shortly in a short while. The study is based on a risk framework with a rubric from low, medium, over to high risk. So I should mention here that the IEU team recognizes that the information provided in the funding proposal documentation may evolve over time. So the stoplight criteria used, and you can see them here on our right-hand side, cannot evaluate the absolute certainty prior to the implementation, but can present a likelihood of success based on the information provided. So now if I can ask you to turn your focus to the right-hand side, here you see the description of all 4 categories which were used for this assessment. So first, we ask whether the proposal included an explicit discussion of the theory of change and the causal linkages for the project. Secondly, we assessed the potential to credibly measure these causal linkages and the ability to report the results using impact measurements. Third, we also assessed the ability to credibly inform on the implementation fidelity of the project, as well as the performance of the project against the GCF investment criteria. And lastly, and this is the fourth category, we also assessed the level of quality of described systems for credible data collection and reporting, as well as the inclusion of budgetary considerations for monitoring and evaluation in the proposal. So again, I should also mention here that in this study, the results of the assessment were also organized by various themes and several questions. So we looked at an organization according to the different periods, the initial resource mobilization period versus the GCF1 period. We looked at the question of LDCs, at the question of SIDS versus others. We looked at private sector, public sector, and the access modality, particular direct access. So now turning to the next slide. Now, before we begin, allow me to briefly summarize and highlight the underlying question. And that is the question here in green. To what extent are GCF projects and programs capable of credibly reporting their own impacts, the efficiency, the effectiveness in an evidence-based and robust way? And again, this is done to assess the quality of the proposals of funding, the quality of the proposals of the FPs, but also to inform the GCF investment criteria, introduced an evidence-based learning opportunity for GCF projects and processes, as well as the Secretariat. and also to inform about the implementation and overall impacts that could be expected. So next slide, please. Now, as we turning to the next slide, we are now going to turn to some of the findings, the key findings that we have in regards to the assessment of the overall portfolio. So next slide, please. So the first category, and in the first category, we used 5 sub-questions to assess and rate the soundness of a theory of change described in the funding proposal. And you see those questions on the right-hand side in this diagram. So now turning to some of the takeaways, we found that most proposals explicitly or implicitly outline the program logic in a reasonable manner and reasonably substantiate the credibility of their claims about causal pathways, with results skewed towards the medium risks. And you see this when you look into the graph in the different coloring, that basically we got quite a high coloring for the blue as well as the green. And the blue would here be explaining the medium risks. An interesting takeaway with respect to the reasonably substantiating the credibility of their claims, we found in particular that 36% of approved funding proposals cite good evidence supporting their causal claims. However, we also found that there are areas of improvements in acknowledging and planning for unintended consequences. So only 34% of the proposals satisfactorily account for the unintended consequences in their GCF funding proposal, with another 28% leaving the matter completely unaddressed. And this is particularly relevant and this may be particularly relevant for discussions around safeguarding and co-benefits for GCF funded activities. So we believe that might be a good takeaway for some of our colleagues in the sustainability team in particular. So when we then compare this from the IRM period versus the GCF1 period, we found that across all 5 sub-questions, the risk rating is slightly improving over time. And I show this to you in the next slide. So next slide, please. So this is basically a graphic, a tabular representation of this comparison between the initial resource mobilization period and the GCF1 period. So the table on the table in front of you, and in particular the table on the right, shows you the risk range for each of the sub-questions for the GCF1 period until 2021. And until the end of 2021. On the left-hand side, you see the risk range for the initial resource mobilization period. So without going over every rating here, perhaps let's focus on question 2 and 3. So could you just click next for me? Yeah, so question 2 and 3 here. So question 2 is discussing the unintended consequences. And as we said, we see there a sharp decline in the quality. And you can see this here with the representation of the percentages in the high risk range. For question 3 on the identification and discussion of causal linkages, we see improvements from 24% in the high risk range in the initial resource mobilization period to now 11%. So in conclusion, if you click again, in conclusion, what we can see is there are improvements in identifying the causal linkages and providing quality evidence on the causal linkages, but there's also a deterioration in the discussion on unintended consequences. So let's move to the next slide and therefore also the next assessed criteria. Here in the third category that we had, we seek to assess if project activities are well targeted to determine the program's performance against the GCF investment criteria, as well as the feasibility of the implementation plans for the overall program. And if the proposal, and it's also looking at if the proposal identifies relevant barriers to implementation and includes the plan to recourse in the event of any constraints. So you see here from figure 8 on the right-hand side that most funding proposals can be determined as low or medium risk. Again, you see this from the graphical diagram here, from the graphical description of the strong bars in green as well as in blue. And apologies. And that is shows you that the description of the implementation plans and the performance against the investment criteria is described quite thoroughly in the funding proposals. That said, some funding proposals do, however, not fully establish the linkages between the performance against the investment criteria and the specific activities and outputs in the theory of change. So we also found that 63% of all funding proposals are careful in identifying potential risk and implementation fidelity and discuss steps to address them. Again, when comparing the initial resource mobilization period versus the GCF1 period, we found an overall slight downward trend in quality. And I show you that on the next slide as well. So next slide. Again, it presents to you the table that shows on the very on the very right-hand side the GCF1 period, and on the left-hand side the IRM period. And you can see again that the results are slightly worsening, or showing a slightly worsening trend with regards to implementation fidelity. So again, to pick two examples here. So click next, please, if you could. Yes. So again, to use two examples in question 3 and 4. That is the question on what extent the impact and paradigm shift potential is identified and measurable. So while, for instance, the high-risk rating for the impact potential has increased over time, so you see this here from 19 to 26% in the high end and the high-risk end, the risk rating related to paradigm shift potential has improved. So while we had 29% for funding proposals in the IRM period that were rated as high risk, only 8% were rated at high risk in the GCF1 period. So now again, if you could click, so in conclusion, what we're showing here is there are improvements in identifying paradigm shift and credibly with credible verification of the investment criteria. However, there's also deterioration in the articulation of the investment criteria, in particular in regards to impact potential, right? And the information on implementation as well as identification of impact potential. So those were two areas that I wanted to highlight here. I now turn it over to my colleague Galina, who will run us through a third area on data collection and reporting, and then also give some additional considerations with regards to themes and groups of countries. So over to you, Galina.
Thanks, Andreas. So yeah, lastly, in the category where we look at data collection and reporting credibility, we see that reporting processes outlined in the proposals are rigorous enough to help identify the causal effects of the GCF investment. And here also on the right side, you see the graph with the examples of questions that we asked to inform us within this area. And the main takeaways from this area would be that first, 36% of funding proposals indicated they were going to collect or already had adequate baseline data for evaluative purposes, putting them at low risk. Another 33% referred to plans or developing a baseline or equivalent exercise. And this would put them at the medium risk. And furthermore, only 27% of FPs are thorough in their description of the frequency as well as level of data collection and reporting necessary to ensure M&E activities would carry on unhindered. While the data collection and reporting requirements are deemed mainly sufficient for overall M&E, an area needing improvement here is the level of transparency and preparedness in the context of full-fledged evaluation. So we see that over 80%, which include low and medium risk, of funding proposals have systems and budgetary allocations either in place or in their plans to conduct the evaluation design in their FPs. And while the evaluation plans might need revisiting, their data collection and reporting plans follow their proposed evaluation strategies. And on the next slide, I want to show you quickly, again, the general distribution of the risk ratings in IRM period and GCF1 period. And generally, the message here, if we click just once, is overall very positive. And we see that on all the questions that we have asked around data collection and reporting credibility, the high risk share of the funding proposals have decreased. And the overall message, click one more time, please, would be that there are improvements in all categories and particularly in collection of baseline data. With that, we will move to look at the couple of findings, looking at the GCF teams. Next slide, please. So first, we wanted to look at how this sort of quality of funding proposal looks when we compare them across the teams, which is one of the main ways that we look at the projects as well. And what we see here on the adaptation part on the left here is that most of adaptation funding proposals are assessed low or medium risk and skewed towards low in categories of theory of change, implementation fidelity, and reporting credibility. And they're skewed towards medium in potential for measurement of causal change. There is a persistent trend of lack of attention to identifying unintended consequences, something that we mentioned in the earlier slides, with 23% of all adaptation proposals deemed at high risk in this area. The main areas of concern to emerge from the adaptation FPs occur also in the area of potential measurement of the causal change, and specifically making explicit methods to measure both causal impact and safeguarding against biased estimates. On the flip side, adaptation FPs systematically discuss performance against investment criteria, which is a very positive message. Unlike our experience with adaptation proposals, now we focus on the central part of the slide, we were able to determine that the mitigation funding proposals were more medium and high risk regarding their theory of change strength and their discussion of causal change and measurement and evaluability overall. Notably, for mitigation FPs, we see persistent trends concerning the lack of attention given to identifying and discussing unintended consequences, with 80% of proposals being marked as medium or high risk, with the latter reaching 40%. Moreover, 52% of mitigation proposals were determined as medium risk in their discussion of causal pathways. One indicator that stands out is implementation fidelity. We determined nearly 50% of mitigation proposals to be medium risk, and 61% and 67% of proposals do not sufficiently provide for measuring paradigm shift potential and measuring against GCF investment criteria, in contrast to adaptation FPs. Finally, moving to the right side of the slide, we see much more even spread of funding proposal quality for cross-cutting projects. Regarding program theory models, we see an even distribution of well-articulated projects with strong and less strong theory of changes. In terms of potential for measurement of causal change, however, they're primarily determined to be lower medium risk, except for concerns around measuring impact and handling bias, which is 71% high risk in handling bias. This further strengthens our overall stoplight paper finding that funding proposals refers to M&E plans, but without exploring methods to measure attributable change. However, in the areas of implementation fidelity and reporting credibility, cross-cutting FPs are more articulate in describing their implementation plans data collection and reporting strategies, and also the identifying risk targeting and implementation fidelity. We can move to the next slide to look onto some insights in terms of LDC versus non-LDC FPs, as well as SITs versus non-SITs FPs. So in theory of change quality, looking at LDC's part, there were no discernible differences in funding proposals that were submitted by LDCs. While they had a marginally higher number of high-risk proposals on identifying causal pathways, they fared considerably better in articulating the causal linkages in their theory of changes relative to non-LDC FPs. In terms of potential for causal change measurement, LDC funding proposals appear to be more likely in medium and high risk, particularly in being prepared to measure causal change and deal with potential bias in their measurement and estimates of impact. Similarly, in implementation fidelity, there is a slightly higher proportion of LDC funding proposals comparing to non-LDC funding proposals that were adjusted as low risk regarding indicators for identifying and measuring paradigm shift potential and performance against GCF investment criteria. So also to briefly speak about SITs, FPs, we observe quite similar differences in this categorization. SITs FPs appear to have a consistently higher number of high risk on theory of change quality than non-SITs proposals. 38% and 35% on SITs submitted proposals were determined to be high risk in their identification and discussion of unintended consequences and the robustness of the causal linkages in their theory of change. We also see 75% of SITs proposals marked as high risk on the likelihood of potential bias. A key area of concern for SITs proposals is their lack of focus on measuring causal effects and the lack of discussion acknowledging the enormous risk of bias in their evaluation strategy. In terms of implementation fidelity, SITs FPs fared similarly to non-SITs ones, and they did even better indicators like identifying paradigm shift potential and measuring performance against other GCF investment criteria, as evidenced by not having any high-risk submissions against these indicators. With that, I think we can close our presentation part, and I'll hand over to Andreas.
Yeah, thanks, Galina. Thanks, colleagues. Apologies. We wanted to also give you the link to the evaluability study and show this here. The paper has been published on our website, so we have it there, and we're really inviting you guys to read the paper and look a little bit in more detail on what we're finding